I had been looking forward to that Saturday for 8 months. I'd marked it on the kitchen calendar in red, the same calendar that still had Earl's handwriting in the bottom corner of a square from 2 years before he passed, where he'd penciled in dentist 10 a.m., and I could never bring myself to tear it out. Haley's wedding, June 14th. My only grandchild. I made the drive from my apartment in Roanoke to the Whitmore Estate venue outside Richmond. 2.5 hours down 81 South with my good navy dress hanging in the back seat and a quilt folded across the passenger side. I'd started that quilt the previous October, hand-stitching individual squares from fabrics that meant something. A piece of Haley's childhood Halloween costume, the yellow gingham from the curtains I'd sewn for my daughter's first apartment, a square of Earl's old flannel shirt, 6 months of evenings, my arthritis be damned. When the young woman at the venue entrance checked her tablet and looked up at me with that particular expression, the kind that means bad news is coming, and she hasn't quite figured out how to say it, I assumed she'd made a mistake. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but I don't see your name on the guest list." I told her my name again. Pearl Langford, mother of the bride's mother. I said it the way you say things when you're absolutely certain there's been an error. She scrolled, looked up. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not listed. I can't allow entry without authorization from the family." I stood there in the June heat with 67-year-old's hands wrapped around a wedding gift I'd poured my soul into, watching through the iron gate as my daughter Chelsea moved across the lawn in her mother of the bride dress, the champagne-colored one I'd helped her pick out at Nordstrom the previous November, and turned away before our eyes could meet. What I didn't know yet, standing at that gate in the sun, was that I had given them $183,000 over 7 years. And they were about to find out what happens when you treat your mother like a bank that never closes. I want to back up and tell you who I am, because this story doesn't make sense without that. I taught 3rd grade at Ridgemont Elementary in Roanoke for 31 years. I know what it's like to show up every single day for people who don't always appreciate you. 8-year-olds aren't particularly grateful, but you do it anyway because you love them and because the work matters. That's just who I am. I show up. It's the only way I know how to be. Earl and I had 34 good years before the pancreatic cancer took him. He was a structural engineer, methodical and patient, the kind of man who balanced the checkbook to the penny and always said, "Keep records. Pearl, keep records." We raised our daughter in a modest house in southwest Roanoke, nothing fancy but full. I worked, he worked. We saved. We weren't rich, but we were careful. When Earl died, my daughter was 32. She and her husband Todd had been married 3 years. They had Haley, who was 4. I watched Earl go in a hospice room on a Tuesday morning in October, and I thought, the way you think things in those final moments that feel truer than anything, I have to hold this family together now. He is gone, and I have to be the thing that holds. So I held the way I knew how, by showing up, by helping, by saying yes. It started the way these things always start, small. 6 months after Earl's funeral, my daughter called to say she and Todd were struggling. His first restaurant idea had eaten through their savings, and she still owed $34,000 in student loans from her nursing degree, a weight she described as a stone around her neck. She was crying. I could hear Haley in the background asking for something, and my daughter's voice stretched thin, trying to answer both of us at once. I said I'd help. Of course I'd help. She was my daughter. That was the first time. It was not the last. Over the 7 years that followed, I covered the down payment on their house in the Short Pump neighborhood outside Richmond. $45,000, which gave them the 20% they needed to avoid PMI on a home that Todd had insisted they needed, even though their combined income at the time barely cleared 70. When my daughter had an emergency gallbladder removal and their high-deductible insurance plan left them holding most of the cost, I wired $22,000, without being asked twice. When Todd tried a second restaurant, a barbecue concept he was convinced would work, I gave them $28,000 for the build-out. It lasted 14 months. When my daughter said she couldn't host Thanksgiving the way she wanted to without a proper kitchen, I paid $21,000 for the quartz countertops and the farmhouse sink she'd shown me pictures of. I covered Haley's orthodontics, 2 car repairs, basement waterproofing after a bad winter, my daughter's continuing education courses, and a week in Cancun that my daughter said they desperately needed after a particularly hard year. I never said no, not once. They were my only family. I drove home from the wedding venue without going inside. The quilt stayed folded on the passenger seat the entire 2.5 hours back to Roanoke. I couldn't look at it. My apartment was quiet when I walked in. It's always quiet. That's what widowhood is, mostly, a kind of silence that settles into the furniture and stays. I sat on the couch in my good navy dress, and I did not move for a long time. The sun went down. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, trying to understand how my daughter could look through an iron gate at me and turn away. At some point, I carried the quilt to the kitchen table. The hand-stitched squares looked wrong under the fluorescent light. The piece of Earl's flannel shirt looked very small. I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, I got up, made coffee, and opened my laptop. Earl had always kept our finances organized. A spreadsheet system I'd taught myself to maintain after he was gone, because he'd insisted on it, because he said records were the only thing between a person and chaos. Every wire transfer, every check, every Zelle payment documented with a date and a purpose. I opened it and started looking. I had never added it all up before. Some part of me, I think, had not wanted to. The student loans, $34,000. The down payment, $45,000. My daughter's medical bills, $22,000. The restaurant build-out, $28,000. The kitchen renovation, $21,000. Then the smaller things, braces, the car repairs, the basement, the vacation, the courses, the years of small wires I'd told myself were just helping. I went line by line, year by year, the way Earl had taught me. By the time the sky started going gray outside my kitchen window, I had a number. $183,000. I sat back and looked at it until it stopped looking like a figure and started looking like something else. Like a life's worth of careful saving, transferred one act of love at a time into someone else's life. Like Earl's retirement accounts, which I had barely touched for myself, quietly redistributed into quartz countertops, and a restaurant that failed, and a vacation to which I was not invited. Like proof of how long I had already lost my daughter before I knew it. I called my friend Charlene at 7 that morning. We'd met 20 years ago at a reading circle at the public library, and she is one of those women who answers the phone at any hour and gets right to the point. She listened to everything. The gate, the quilt, the spreadsheet, the $183,000. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Pearl," she said, "you need to talk to a lawyer." I started to say it wasn't like that. It was family. She cut me right off. "They walked you to the gate of your own granddaughter's wedding and sent you home. You gave them $183,000, and they handed you a closed gate. That is not a misunderstanding. That's a decision that was made." Charlene had been through something similar with her brother years before. Money lent, never repaid, relationships turned into weapons when she finally asked. She gave me the name of an attorney in downtown Roanoke, Maxine Wheeler. Said she was not cheap, but she was worth every dollar. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I thought about my daughter in that champagne dress, turning away. Then I opened my browser and sent Maxine Wheeler's office an email. That same afternoon, I went into my bank's online portal and found the automatic transfers I'd been sending to my daughter's account each month. The $800 I'd been adding since the restaurant closed What I'd told myself was just helping with groceries while Todd found his footing. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I canceled it. I found the other recurring transfers. 100 here, 200 there. Things that had become habits so quietly I'd stopped noticing them. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Each click felt like setting down something heavy. I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Maxine Wheeler's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Jefferson Street downtown. She was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed with reading glasses she wore on top of her head until she needed them. She spent 20 minutes going through my documentation without saying much. Earl's spreadsheet system had captured everything: dates, amounts, and the text messages where my daughter had written things like, "I'll get this back to you when Todd's back on his feet, and you're literally saving us." "Did you sign anything stating these were gifts?" Maxine asked. I had not. It was family. You don't draw up contracts with your own daughter. Maxine looked at me over her glasses. Without written documentation categorizing these as gifts, there's a legal argument that they were implied loans, particularly given the language in these messages. She tapped the printouts. She uses the phrase, "get this back to you," twice in the first year alone. That's an acknowledgement of debt in her own words. I asked what she recommended. First, a formal demand letter, itemized, certified mail. It establishes legal record and puts them on notice. She paused. Sometimes that's enough to wake people up. Sometimes they understand what's actually at stake and they change course. I signed the retainer agreement and wrote a check for $3,200. My savings dropped a little further. But for the first time since standing at that iron gate in the heat, I felt something other than grief. The letter went out by certified mail 4 days later. I imagined my daughter opening the envelope, seeing the law firm letterhead, reading the itemized list. Every wire transfer, every check, every dollar, dated and documented. Good, let her feel a fraction of what I felt at that gate. My daughter called 6 times the following morning before 9 o'clock. I watched her name light up on the screen and let it go to voicemail each time. By noon, she'd switched to texts. "Mom, please pick up. I don't understand what this letter is about, but you're scaring me. The wedding was a miscommunication. Please let me explain. Please, I need to talk to you." A miscommunication. I held my phone and looked at that word for a long time. Then I forwarded everything to Maxine. 2 days later, they drove up from Richmond. I saw Todd's truck from my window, my daughter getting out quickly, her face pale and tight. The intercom buzzed. "Mom, it's me. Can we please come up? 5 minutes." I pressed the button. "Put a repayment proposal in writing and send it through my attorney," I said. "That's the way forward." "Mom, please don't do this." I released the button and went back to the book I was reading. A memoir Charlene had lent me, about a woman who'd hiked the Appalachian Trail alone at 64. I'd been meaning to read it for months. They stood outside for almost 20 minutes. I watched from the window. At some point, Todd put his hand on my daughter's shoulder, and she shook it off. Eventually, they got back in the truck and left. I waited for the guilt to arrive, that particular maternal reflex, the pull toward making things right for her, even when she was the one who'd done wrong. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and steadier, something that felt a lot like solid ground. About 3 weeks after the demand letter, I received a text from a woman named Ingrid, someone I'd taught alongside at Ridgemont for 12 years before she retired and moved closer to her own grandchildren in the Richmond area. We stayed in touch loosely. Holiday cards, the occasional check-in. "Pearl, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I feel like I'd want to know. I was at a cafe last Thursday and overheard your daughter at the next table with some friends," she said, and I'm quoting as closely as I can remember. "My mother's always needed to be needed. The money was never really about helping us. It was about making sure we couldn't forget her." I left before she noticed me. "I'm so sorry. I just thought you deserved to know." I read the message 4 times. Then I forwarded it to Maxine, but I sat with those words much longer than I'd sat with anything else. The money was never really about helping us. It was about making sure we couldn't forget her. Part of me wanted to call my daughter that instant and tell her that was the cruelest thing I'd ever heard said about me. Another part, the part that had been sitting with the spreadsheet and the gray dawn light, went quiet and asked a different question. Had my help ever come with strings I hadn't admitted to myself? Had I ever said I'll cover this, but you really should, and then told her how to do it? I thought about the kitchen renovation. I'd pushed for a particular tile backsplash. I remembered saying if I was paying for it, I wanted it done right. I remembered my daughter's expression when I said it. Not the same as what she'd done. Not even in the same universe as turning away from your mother at an iron gate. But it wasn't nothing, either. I took out a piece of paper and wrote 2 columns. Things I did wrong. Things that are still true. The first column was shorter, but it was honest. I'd sometimes made my help feel like a performance. I'd stayed at the center of their lives, partly because I was terrified of the silence that would be left if I didn't. The silence that had been there since Earl died and never fully left. Understanding yourself is not the same as excusing what was done to you. I was old enough to know that. Mediation was held in a conference room at a neutral attorney's office in Richmond on a Thursday morning in September. I wore a deep teal blouse. Earl's favorite color on me, because I wanted something of his in that room. My daughter arrived with Todd, and their attorney, a man named Russell from a small firm in Henrico County. My daughter looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Todd looked like a man who had spent years hoping that if he stayed quiet enough, difficult things would resolve themselves. He'd always been that way. Not malicious, just absent. I'd watched him be absent for 7 years while my daughter made every decision and called me to absorb the consequences. The mediator was a retired family court judge named Warren, calm and deliberate, who had clearly seen everything there was to see. Russell opened by calling the transfers a pattern of voluntary gifting by a devoted mother. Maxine opened by playing a voicemail, my daughter's voice from 4 years earlier. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask, but if you could float us through the end of the quarter, I promise we'll square up when Todd gets his payout. You're literally saving us." The word literally stayed in the room. Maxine presented the full spreadsheet. Every item projected on a screen at the end of the conference table. Dates, amounts. My daughter's own words describing the money as something to be paid back. $183,000, itemized line by line in Earl's system, maintained by me for 7 years because he'd taught me that records were the only thing between a person and chaos. Russell had no documentation showing gifts. He had the family relationship and nothing else. My daughter started crying about 40 minutes in, which I had not expected. Not the composed kind, the real kind, the kind that wrecks your breathing and makes your shoulders curve inward. "You made it impossible to say no to you," she said. It came out jagged. "Every time I tried to manage something on our own, you'd already called and offered. You'd wire money before Todd and I even finished talking about it. I felt like I was failing every time I accepted it, and failing worse every time I didn't." She stopped. Started again. "I felt like I owed you something that couldn't be paid back." I looked at her across the table. "Then why didn't you ever say that to me?" "Because you'd get sad. Because you'd say you just wanted to help your family. Because saying no to you meant managing your feelings about being pushed away." She looked at her hands. It was easier to take the money. The room held that for a moment. "I hear you," I said, and I kept my voice very steady. "I hear that my help sometimes came with pressure you shouldn't have had to carry, and none of that gives you the right to look through a gate at your own mother and turn away. None of it turns $183,000 into a gift without my consent." "I didn't make the guest list," she said very quietly. "You saw me standing there, You turned away." She didn't answer that. She put her face in her hands. Todd cleared his throat. The sound was too loud in the quiet room. "It was my mother," he said. Everyone looked at him. He straightened slightly, as if he'd made a decision he'd been postponing for a long time. "Gail. She told Chelsea it would be better if the wedding was kept to immediate family. She'd been saying for years that." He stopped, looked at his wife. "I assumed you'd told your mother directly." My daughter's hands dropped from her face. She stared at her husband. "I told you I didn't want to have that conversation." "You didn't stop her from making the call." Two people who had been avoiding something for years, with nowhere left to avoid it. Warren called a short recess. In the hallway, Maxine leaned close. "That is an admission of inaction," she said. "We're in a strong position." The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. My daughter and her husband agreed to repay $183,000 over 8 years, structured as a formal loan agreement at 3% interest. Maxine's insistence. A lien was placed on the short pump house as security. The first payment would be due the first of the following month. They did not contest it. By that point, I don't think there was anything left to contest. I drove home from the signing and stopped at the Kroger on the way. I bought a pot roast and the ingredients my mother had always used: carrots, celery root, dried thyme, a good can of broth. I hadn't made it since Earl died. I made it that evening alone in my kitchen, and I ate at my own table with a glass of red wine, and I did not feel victorious. Victory would have meant the last 7 years had gone differently. What I felt was something quieter, like the ground had come back under my feet. Charlene had been after me for 2 years to take the watercolor class at the Community Arts Center on Luck Avenue. I finally signed up. My first painting was an embarrassment, a blue heron that looked more like a question mark with wings, and I loved it so much I hung it in my kitchen. I signed up to volunteer on Tuesday mornings at the main library branch, helping adults learn to read the way. I spent 31 years helping children figure out how words worked. I walked every evening in the neighborhood. I lost 7 pounds without trying. My calendar, which had been so full of their lives, became full of my own. In October, I drove out to the cemetery and sat beside Earl's headstone the way I do sometimes, when I need to think something all the way through. "I did something you'd have called the right thing," I told him. The October light came through the oak trees in that particular amber that makes everything look like it matters. It cost more than I wanted to pay. I picked a piece of dried grass off my coat. My daughter and I, we weren't exactly wrong about each other. We were just both wrong in how we tried to love. I sat with him a while, then I drove home. The letter from my daughter arrived on a Tuesday in November. Her handwriting, careful and even, the way it's always been, the way Earl used to say she got from me. "Mom, I don't have a good excuse for the wedding. I told myself I was staying out of it, that it wasn't my conflict to manage, and I know now that staying out of it was its own kind of choice. I chose the easier thing. I've been doing that for years when it came to you. It was easier to take your help than to be honest about how it made me feel, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm in therapy now. Started in August, I'm trying to understand what I actually want, instead of just reacting to whoever's voice is loudest in the room. I'm not writing to ask you to forget. I don't think I could forget it either, if I were you. I'm writing because you're my mother, and I'm almost 40 years old, and I don't know how to have you in my life, and I don't know how to not. I love you, I'm sorry, Chelsea." I read it twice. Then I put it on the kitchen table in the spot where the quilt used to sit. I donated the quilt to a church auction in September. Someone had paid $60 for it. I hope they know what they have. I wrote back that same evening. "Chelsea, I believe you, and I believe the therapy is hard, and I'm glad you're doing it. I want to tell you something I've been sitting with since the mediation. You weren't entirely wrong that my help sometimes came with an audience. I was so afraid of being left behind after your father died that I made myself impossible to leave behind. And that wasn't fair to you. I have my own work to do, and I'm doing it. My mistakes don't erase what happened. The money still needs to be repaid because that was always the honest arrangement, whatever we told ourselves at the time. But I want you to know I understand my part in how we got here. I'm not ready for Sunday dinners. I'm not sure when I will be. But I am not closed to the possibility of you, someday, if you do the work and I do mine. That is the most honest thing I have to give you right now. Your father would want us to find our way back to each other. I want that too. I'm just not willing to pretend I'm not hurt in order to get there faster. I love you, Mom. I sealed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and walked it down to the mailbox on the corner in the cold. On the way back, I stopped and looked up, the way Earl always did. He said if you wanted perspective, you looked up. The stars were beginning to show over the Blue Ridge. This wasn't the retirement I'd imagined when Earl was alive and Haley was small and everything still felt like it was going to hold. But it was mine. I had chosen it or it had chosen me, and either way I was standing in it, with my feet on solid ground and my eyes open. That turned out to be enough. Most evenings, sitting at my kitchen table with the lopsided blue heron, painting on the wall, and a good cup of tea, and the particular quiet that belongs only to me now, it turned out to be more than enough.